Okay, well, I didn't mean to make this video either, but after making my video about orcs, I thought, hey, I could do racial deep dives because I already have blog posts that I can convert very easily into YouTube videos by mostly just reading them and adding some video to it. So I'm going to talk briefly about orcs and goblins in Dark Fantasy X. Let me first go ahead and give you the stats for orcs and goblins. Orcs are +2 to strength. And then it says orcs are similar to humans, but with an olive drab to gray skin and a more robust muscular build. Orcs are famously stereotyped, correctly to be fair, as savage and barbaric and not particularly intellectual. They are sometimes prized as neighbors for their ability to outdo others in manual labor. While they mostly come from and still live in their own homeland of Gunacht outside the scope of the setting, some few have spread to other lands. And goblins are small, often perceived of by others as ugly and untrustworthy. Goblins are a different phenotype or subspecies related to the orcs and share the same homeland as they do. They usually have a greenish or brownish leathery skin, wide faces, pointed teeth, and average about 4 feet tall. They are rangy and wiry most of the time, +1 to dex and a +2 to the bushcraft skill. And then at a deeper dive discussion of orcs and goblins, let me read that as well, too. Orcs and goblins, it's difficult to discuss their relationship to people because it's somewhat mysterious. They look like people. Unlike all of the other races in the setting, however, they are not people. In this, they are unique among all the player character races of Dark Fantasy X. Woodwoses, Kemlings, Elementalists, Grizzlings, Seraphs, and even the now defunct Grendling or Wendak race are all human races that have been changed by some event that can be pointed to in the historical record. A curse, a breeding event with some supernatural creature like a werewolf, demon, or ifrit, etc. They are all demi-humans, but the orcs and goblins are the only playable races that are just straight up not humans, although to be fair, human-like in many ways. Academics in Mittermarkt, Grozovest, Garenport, Baromir, Samashki, and elsewhere have debated what this means for some time without any conclusive consensus emerging. Are they highly aberrant humans, perhaps? Are they something else entirely? Do they even have souls? Many people hope so, since many orcs and goblins, especially in the Three Realms, are practicing Christians. A related question is, what exactly is the difference between an orc and a goblin? They have always been associated together as far back as recorded history can manage to determine, yet they are very obviously physically different. Although it happens very rarely, and there may not even be an example of it anywhere in the Three Realms, both orcs and goblins assure us that in Gunacht, their homeland, it's well known that orcs and goblins can marry and produce viable offspring with each other, although that offspring is always goblin, never orc, and there are very few hybrid traits other than a few cosmetic hints of the orc ancestry. Although their history is more or less the same between the two races, it's not even clear that orcs and goblins are really the same species at all, or if they are merely closely related ones like horses and donkeys. In spite of that, the label Orclings is often used to refer to both groups together. Orcs are the most human-like. They tend to look similar to exceptionally robust humans with thicker and larger bones and muscles that average about human height. A bit more than Tarushans, but just a bit less than Hillmen and Timishers on average. Their features are also bigger, thicker, almost Neanderthal-like, thick skulls with occasionally brow ridges and heavy jaws. They do have enlarged teeth compared to people, although they are not sharp and they do not protrude from the mouth when closed as in other fantasy settings. They are neither more nor less hairy than people. Their skin color is a grayish olive drab that varies from a dark, almost pine green to a light gray or khaki color with only a slight greenish cast. While their reputation is that they are slow-witted and primitive in addition to being strong, making them seem occasionally by people in the Three Realms as best utilized as heavy manual labor, the reality is that they aren't much less intelligent than people. They are notable for lacking in impulse control and forethought, possibly as a result of uncountable generations living in a tropical and semi-tropical environment where food was readily available year-round without the need for harvesting, planting, storing, etc., And their culture is seen by the humans of any culture of the three realms as vibrant, which is a polite way of saying that it's occasionally fun and exciting while also being primitive and dysfunctional by human standards and unable to produce high civilizations on its own. However, exposure to human civilizations has allowed the most talented individuals amongst orcs to integrate more successfully when desired, or at least borrow elements from human civilization to improve their own lives to a more human civilization standard. That said, most behavior is genetic rather than taught, so it is only the relatively exceptional individuals that leave behind their inherent orcish behavior. As an editorial aside, I'm trying to straddle a line between orcs as they're often traditionally portrayed in fantasy, but making it clear that it's not obligatory for orcs to be anything like that. They're a bit more complex if they are more humanized rather than written off and dismissed as bad guy goons that can be killed with impunity because they have no redeeming features. Not only that, they are playable, as noted. If you need expendable goons, then Thyrses probably better fit that role. As a curious editorial aside, inside the editorial aside, it's interesting to me that Thyrses and orcs, of course, are the same thing. Tolkien, when he created the word orc, took it from Old English, and it was a compound. It was called orc thyrse. And so thyrse is kind of the other word for orc in a lot of ways, and it has cognates in Nordic and other Germanic languages. Anyway, exactly what Thyrse relationship to humanity or orclings, either one, is another intriguing question without a good answer. Goblins are much smaller than orcs, standing 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with very exceptional individuals standing maybe 4.5 feet tall. They also have green skin, usually have wider faces and sharper, although smaller teeth than orcs. But like orcs, they don't have lots of non-human features like floppy or pointed ears or faces that are too radically divergent from human faces. Being significantly smaller, they're obviously not as strong as an orc or a human either, for that matter, although they do have a wiry strength and endurance that's more than one would expect at first glance. Rather, they tend to be sneakier and faster. If orcs are more likely to be the violent warriors in their society, the goblins have an almost parallel underfoot society as laborers, hunters, and all too often criminals and purveyors of other shady professions. Because they've been this way for generations, they haven't adapted or integrated well into the three-realm society, reverting all too easily to a more scavenger/criminal lifestyle and living underfoot in slums and ghettos. The better of them trend more towards being the scavengers and tinkerers, while the worst are just out-and-out pickpockets and criminals. But the reality is that it's a spectrum for most individuals, not binary endpoints. For goblins, I wanted to straddle the same line between not exactly bad guys, but be careful around them that I did for orcs, except give them the sneak thief archetype rather than the barbarian warrior archetype. From a setting perspective, I suggest that orcs and goblins are rare in the three realms, but not so rare that a PC would be an object of wide-eyed exotica. They are often looked down upon by the people of the three realms, but not really because they're seen as inferior, rather because it's debatable by both humans and orclings alike whether they can really integrate peacefully together very well, or if they do better having their own separate places to live where they can live as their own natures and cultures allow without messing with each other. This is unfortunately coming to a head because, as we shall see when I get to these in the 5x5 front for the Shadows over Garenport, conditions in Gunacht are worse than normal right now, and a larger number than ever before are migrating northward to join those who've been in the area already. Within the cities and homelands of humanity, this is viewed with some trepidation, as there's a noticeable drop in quality of life being around too many orclings. Sorry, I've had a cold today. Crime increases, noise increases, maintenance of homes, streets, or farms in the neighborhood decreases, services are poorer, etc. While most humans in the three realms are nice enough to not have a problem with a relatively small number of orclings living among them, what is starting to look more and more like a significant migration is not what they asked for. However, some of the more canny and civilized of the orcling leaders have managed to negotiate a settlement with many of the leaders of the three realms, and the territory of the Chersky Island in the Darkling Sea, which had multiple claims on it but which nobody was actually using, was more or less ceded to the migrating orclings, and they were told that they could settle and homestead and fish and farm and trade and do whatever they wanted to with that as their own autonomous community, and they'd be left alone, much like an Indian reservation, except without any federal funding. However, the rise in piracy on the Darkling Sea by Orcling crews is threatening that deal. So I have two different themes that will come up in the 5x5, both of which I haven't yet hit as I've discussed columns of my 5x5. One of them deals with a caravan of migrating Orclings coming from Gunacht. And in this one, I want them to be kind of threatened in the Thirstwood Forest. They will be likable, charismatic, even good-looking orcs. So they will kind of bunk the stereotype of orcs. They will be orcs that are as people-like as you can get. The other big threat, however, is the one I mentioned earlier with piracy on the Darkling Sea. And these pirates are almost exclusively Orclings, and they have become so problematic that many of the city-states and nations around the Darkling Sea are about fed up with them and are ready to kind of sweep them all off of Chersky Island entirely. And the PCs will have an opportunity to kind of investigate Chersky Island, and if they care to, they will discover that, of course, there are many villages of regular farmers, fishers, and whatnot who don't have anything to do with the pirates, and in fact, in some ways, they're as victimized by the pirates as anybody else. But the pirates will be real pieces of work. I mean, these are going to be cultists of Dagon. They're going to be, you know, the worst stereotypes of orc from the worst type of, well, not the worst, but from, you know, the fantasies that have orcs as these terrible stereotypes. That's what the pirates are going to be like for the most part. So the PCs, again, will have to decide. It'll be a nice moral quandary. Do they care to differentiate? Do they want to try and make life better for the innocent farmers and fishermen? Or are they going to say, well, look, where'd the pirates come from if not from those villages eventually? And it's kind of in the orcs' nature to eventually turn to piracy when things get a little hard, because, you know, if things are hard, they can always just take by violence what they want. And that's often kind of what the pirates have done. So, like I said earlier, I kind of want to straddle the line with the orcs. I want them to be like orcs that you're used to if you're an old-fashioned player of fantasy games, but I want to also give them some nuance and make them a little bit more complex and make it a little bit harder to just treat them as, you know, oh, they're just monsters, you can kill them with impunity. There are creatures that are just monsters that you can kill with impunity, but orcs and goblins are not those people, and orcs and goblins are, in fact, a playable race in the Dark Fantasy X. So that's what I've done with orcs and goblins, and like I said in my last video, I've tried to kind of give them some nuance and try to make them a little interesting without completely just subverting what they are. And I think I've done that, and I've done it for completely different reasons than what Wizards of the Coast has done, although to some degree the end result's more important than the reason, right? And so in some ways what I've done is not necessarily terribly different than what Wizards of the Coast have done, even though I've done it for with completely different motivation. Anyway, that's what I got for Orcs and Goblins. Sorry to throw this one in. It was not in my original plan. I do have other deep dives for the other races that I want to do coming up, so I don't want that to distract me from finishing my 5x5 columns, so I'll try to get them both done in relatively short order.